afternoon. I'd like to thank the ASSAL for inviting me here today to talk a little bit about ICP 8, Risk Management and Internal Controls. While I'm with the NAIC in the US, I'm actually here today speaking on behalf of the IAS, where I am the Vice Chairman of the Implementation Committee. So my presentation today will touch upon a couple of issues. Firstly, we're going to talk about what are the objectives of ICP 8. We'll talk about the key concepts which underpin this ICP, talk about some of the general observations, why this ICP was updated in recent years, and then we're going to go into a little bit more detail about the IAS self-assessment and peer review process. In particular, we're going to look at the results that came out of this self-assessment and peer review on corporate and risk governance. So right here we can see that at a high level, the objective of ICP 8 is to ensure that there are risk management and internal control systems within an insurer. And ultimately, what we're looking for, the risk management control systems have to have some key strategies, some policies, some processes, controls, all developed so that the risks can be identified at both the legal entity and the wider group entity. Ultimately, risk management and internal control is a key part and fabric of the insurer's governance. Ultimately, what we say is that risk strategy is defined and approved at the board level. Therefore, one has to have control functions in place. These systems need to include a risk management function, a compliance function, an actuarial function, and also an internal audit function. All of this has to be defined, and you have to embed your risk appetite within the company's framework. You need clear direction and leadership at the management level and at the board level. Ultimately, a sound risk culture has to be promoted throughout the organization, from top to bottom. But one must not forget, however, that all of these principles have to be commensurate with the nature, scale, and complexity of the business. And I'll touch upon this a little later. So here we have the ICP 8. This is the high-level principle. And as you may know, the ICPs, you have the core principle, you have the standards, and then you have the guidance. This ICP was revised in 2011 in light of lessons learned from the financial crisis. One of the key lessons learned in the financial crisis was there was mismanagement at a number of different insurers. So ultimately, what was needed was robust governance and improved risk management. So ultimately, this revised ICP created an explicit expectation of the supervisor that the insurer have the appropriate risk management and internal controls. So let's break down the statement a little further. Ultimately, it states that the supervisor sets the standard. However, the ultimate responsibility lies with the board. The board is required to oversee and ensure that the insurer, down to the legal entity level, has the systems in place to address the key risks it faces, the key legal and regulatory obligations, and it is up to the insurer to ensure that the senior management implements these properly. The insurer needs to ensure that the resources and support functions are in place to ensure these internal controls. But then it is up to the supervisor to ensure that they develop the practices to assess the insurer's system of risk management and internal controls. But again, proportionality is key. The systems and functions need to be adequate for the nature, scale, and complexity of the insurer's business and risks, and adapted as the insurer's business and internal and external circumstances change. So let's go a little deeper from the principle and look at some of the standards. So ICP 8.1 and 8.2 are really just going into a little bit more detail as to effectively defining what the role of the supervisor will be. ICP 8.2 is key. If you notice, authority, independence, and resources. Those are the key words within ICP 8.2. So standards 8.3, 4, and then on the next slide, 5 and 6, are the basic components of an internal control functions. Ultimately, insurer has to have a clearly defined risk management strategy with the objectives, responsibilities, and a risk appetite for each type of risk. It's important that there be effective internal controls with the authority, independence, and resources. And we noted earlier that another key component of internal controls that was identified was developing an actuarial function. And ultimately, what we've heard is that sometimes insurers don't have the resources to have their own actuaries on staff. So that's when they have to outsource that to consulting firms. But ultimately, if you notice 8.7, it talks about what the supervisor needs to look for in regards to outsourced functions. Ultimately, the board and management should remain responsible in respect of all functions or activities that are outsourced. Effectively, the outsourcing of a function does not reduce the burden of the insurer to comply with the various different rules and regulations that are in place currently. So at a high level, these are the standards and the principles. And this was, as I said, revised extensively in 2011. And it was 2 years ago that the IAS did an assessment to take a look at where things stand today. So next portion of my presentation will really focus more on what are the global trends in regards to the implementation of ICP 8. So let's talk a little bit about the IAS Assessment Program. Back in 2011, the IAS developed a self-assessment and peer review program. The goals of this program were to ensure an independent and consistent assessment of observance. We wanted to know at any given point of time, where do IAS members stand in terms of implementing the ICPs? It's not good enough just to develop a standard if it's not implemented. So the role I have at the IAS is ensuring the implementation of the standards in each jurisdiction where appropriate on a consistent basis, but also proportionality is key throughout all of this. So we're looking at assessing different jurisdictions, and a number of markets said, but we already have to do assessments for the IMF World Bank as part of our FSAPs. We already have, for FSB members, we already have to do FSB peer reviews, country reviews, both thematically. And then we have IMF Article 4's annual assessments of the market. Why is the IAS adding yet another assessment which requires more resources. So ultimately, we wanted to make sure that whatever we developed was manageable from a resource perspective, both from the IAS level and also from the IAS member level. We wanted to be able to use these assessments to be able to provide insights to our partners, such as the Access to Insurance Initiative. Ultimately, the goal is to identify gaps in regulation and then be able to take those results and be able to use them to improve standards of regulation throughout the world. Ultimately, we're all trying to ensure policyholder protection, and to do that, we all need to be constantly evolving and improving and adapting our regulations. So that's one of the other elements of this program, is we provide insights to our partners. We wanted to make sure that this program ultimately was not duplicative of the IMF, World Bank FSAPs, or the FSB peer reviews. And probably one of the most important parts of this assessment program is that it provides input to the standard setting process. We have a feedback loop. So when we identify problems with the ICP, where there are issues in implementing it, whether it may not be clear enough, or it's too complex, or it doesn't achieve the objective which we want, that gets fed back to the technical committee. And the technical committee looks at that and tries to improve upon it. So that was the goal of developing this self-assessment and peer review program. And when we do an assessment, we do a questionnaire, and then the peer review team reviews the responses, and then from there, we provide a rating. And the difference between the IAS self-assessment and peer review program and the IMF self-assessments, or World Bank self-assessments for an FSAP, are that you don't give yourself a rating. The rating is given to you by the IAS peer review team. So that makes the program independent and more consistent and more robust than ever before. So what are we looking at when we do an assessment? We're looking to see, does the jurisdiction have the legislative authority to achieve the objective? And that's for each standard below the principle. Do the policies and procedures exist to put legislative framework into practice? And ultimately, does the supervisor undertake the activity to achieve the objective? So what we're really saying here is, you can have the best laws developed for you, implemented in your statute, but if you're not implementing it effectively and actually using the powers that you have, then you're not meeting the standards. So that's key. It's how do you actually meet the standard, not just what you have in law. So in terms of the assessments, we've conducted assessments on group supervision, corporate governance. We're currently conducting self-assessment and peer reviews on supervisory measures, market conduct, and then this year we're going to be launching new assessments on solvency and solvency-related issues, macroprudential and reinsurance, and also changes in control and portfolio transfer. So, turning to the corporate and risk governance assessment, ICP 8 was assessed as part of a larger assessment on corporate governance in 2012 and 2013. 69 jurisdictions, supervisory authorities participated, and largely what we found is that many have the laws, the regulations, the policies in place. But what we found was that supervisors were very reactive as opposed to proactive. And that was one of the trends that we saw worldwide. The other thing which we noticed was that many jurisdictions rely on a legislative framework on corporate governance that is not insurance specific. They may rely on corporate or securities law, and the ICP is geared more towards ensuring there is an insurance-specific corporate governance law. So what were some of the results of the ICP 8? What we noticed was that this was one of the hardest ICPs to meet among the 4 ICPs that were assessed. The lowest observance of all of them, in fact. So what we can see here was that of the FSB jurisdictions, only 7 out of 23 were fully observed on this ICP. The majority were largely observed. If we step back and if we compare other jurisdictions to FSB jurisdictions, it's pretty similar. The majority of jurisdictions fall within the largely or observed category, with very few partly observed and none who were not observed. So let's look at, let's focus in a little bit on the Americas. What we found was that observance of ICP 8 in the Americas was actually slightly higher. Of the ICP 8, we created this little index which kind of shows us the average, and what we found was that 7.5 was our average there. So it's good to see that in the Americas we're further along than some of other jurisdictions around the world in terms of observing ICP 8. But the standard which had the highest number of supervisors with assessment lower than observed was standard 8.2. So effectively, if we look down at the bottom, we find that in the Americas, actually, we had a lower observance of this standard compared to the rest of the world. It's a good question as to why, and I'd be interested to hear if any members in the audience have any thoughts as to why standard 8.2 was observed less here in the Americas than the rest of the world. And just as a reminder, standard 8.2 is the supervisor requires the insurer to have control functions with authority, independence, and resources. So the expert team put together some recommendations, and they put together their report as to what they found. Ultimately, one of their key recommendations was that supervisors need to have the power to require insurers to have all the control functions, and the independence, the necessary resources, and authority need to be in place. Also, what was found is that some supervisors will look for one control function, but not another, when ultimately the ICP is calling for supervisors to have all of these control functions, not one or the other. So that was one of the lessons learned as well. And then the other thing was related to where in your law is it defined about these internal control requirements. Is it in your corporate or securities law, or is it in your insurance law? That was another finding that we had in this report. And ultimately, supervisors need to be more proactive. I think that was the key message that came out of this study. For many years, we've been very reactive, and as we all move towards a more risk-based supervision system, we need to be proactive and looking for problems. And that means working closely with the insurers to identify potential problems before they emerge and before they become bigger problems. So ultimately, these were some of the challenges with observance and some of the recommendations that came out of this assessment program. And let me close by making a quick pitch to all IAS members to actively participate in the self-assessment and peer review program. It's very important that you participate so that you know where you stand internally in implementing the standards. If you are to improve the supervision in your jurisdictions, it's important to know where you stand. So I would encourage you all to participate And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.